I stood in line at Walmart, my EBT card trembling in my sweaty palm, while my sister-in-law Jessica laughed loud enough for half the store to hear. Seriously, Marcus? Food stamps? At your age? Her voice dripped with that particular brand of cruelty that only family can master. Behind us, her two perfectly dressed kids giggled, mimicking her tone. Uncle Marcus is poor, Mommy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My brother David just stood there, examining his manicured nails like they held the secrets of the universe. The cashier, a teenager with purple hair and tired eyes, avoided looking at me directly. The line behind us grew longer. People started checking their phones, shifting their weight, that universal language of impatience filling the air around us like smoke. Then the store manager appeared, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair, pulled back in a military-style bun. She took one look at me, at the card in my hand, at the uniform jacket I wore over my civilian clothes because it was the only warm thing I owned that didn't have holes in it. Her posture changed entirely. "Colonel Martinez," she said, her voice cutting through Jessica's laughter like a blade. "Your order takes priority." "Register 3, please." She turned to her employee. "Ring up the colonel immediately. Full military discount applies." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. "My name is Marcus Antonio Martinez. I'm 42 years old, and 6 months ago I was leading a reconnaissance unit through the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Today I was standing in a grocery store in Tucson, Arizona, using government assistance to buy ramen noodles and expired milk, while my own family treated me like a walking embarrassment. The apartment I called home was a studio in the kind of complex where the pool has been drained for 3 years, and the parking lot is more pothole than asphalt. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Chen next door arguing with her son about his college grades every Tuesday night at exactly 9:15. The kitchen was a corner with a hot plate, a mini fridge that made sounds like a dying animal, and a sink that only gave hot water if you jiggled the handle just right while saying a prayer to whatever deity handled plumbing emergencies. I had moved in there after spending 2 months sleeping in my car, a 2008 Honda Civic, with a passenger door that only opened from the outside, and air conditioning that worked exclusively during winter. Before the car, there had been 3 weeks in a shelter downtown, where they served breakfast at 5:30 in the morning and asked no questions as long as you were sober and kept your hands to yourself. The transition from Colonel Marcus Martinez, decorated officer with 23 years of service, to Marcus, the guy who counted quarters before buying coffee, had happened faster than a deployment rotation. One day, I was reviewing intelligence reports in a secure facility outside Kabul, making decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of soldiers under my command. The next, I was filling out disability paperwork in a VA office that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. The bureaucracy was its own kind of warfare. Forms that led to more forms. Appointments that got rescheduled 3 times before happening. Caseworkers who looked at you like you were trying to scam the system rather than access benefits you had earned with 2 decades of service. And a back injury that made it impossible to sleep through the night without prescription pain medication that cost more than my monthly food budget. My brother David had made his fortune in real estate during the boom years, buying and flipping houses in Phoenix when the market was hot and money flowed like water in the desert. His wife Jessica had never worked a day in her adult life, but she had opinions about everyone else's financial decisions. They lived in a gated community called Desert Oaks Estates, where the HOA fees cost more than my rent, and the mailboxes were made of imported stone. David had called me 3 weeks earlier, his voice carrying that particular tone of obligation mixed with irritation that successful siblings reserve for their struggling relatives. "Jessica wants to take the kids school shopping," he said. "Thought maybe you could come along. Family time, you know? The kids barely know their uncle." I should have said no. Should have recognized the trap hidden in his casual invitation. But I missed them. Missed being part of something that felt like family. Even if that family had spent the last 6 months treating my situation like a temporary inconvenience, rather than a complete restructuring of everything I thought I knew about my life. The shopping trip had started innocently enough. Jessica had picked me up in her white BMW SUV, the kind with heated seats and a sound system that probably cost more than most people's cars. The kids, Emma and Jake, 8 and 10 respectively, had been excited to see me. They peppered me with questions about the army, about Afghanistan, about whether I had ever shot anyone. I deflected with stories about the food, the landscape, the friends I had made overseas, the lighter side of a life they were too young to understand. But as we walked through Target first, then Best Buy, then finally Walmart, Jessica's comments had grown sharper, more pointed. She made jokes about my discount shopping habits, my coupons, the way I checked prices on everything before putting it in the cart. When I suggested we skip the name brand cereal for the store brand, she laughed like I had told her the funniest joke in the world. "Marcus, it's $2 difference," she said, loud enough for other shoppers to hear. "Live a little." When I quietly explained that $2 was the difference between having lunch tomorrow or not, her expression changed. Not to sympathy or understanding, but to something that looked almost like disgust. Like my poverty was a personal failing rather than the result of a system that churned through veterans like disposable equipment. David had remained silent through most of it, the way he had learned to do during childhood when our father's temper would flare. He was a master of strategic invisibility, of being present but not accountable, of letting things happen around him without taking responsibility for stopping them. By the time we reached the grocery section of Walmart, I was carrying a basket with the bare minimum: bread, peanut butter, milk, eggs, and a package of ramen noodles that would stretch across 4 meals if I was careful. Jessica's cart overflowed with organic produce, premium cuts of meat, imported cheese, wine that cost more per bottle than I spent on food in a week. At the checkout line, she had made the comment about food stamps loud enough for everyone to hear, and I felt 23 years of military training, of leadership under pressure, of maintaining composure in life and death situations, crumble under the weight of public humiliation served up by someone who was supposed to love me. The worst part wasn't the laughter or the stares from strangers. It was the look on my nephew and niece's faces, the way their excitement about spending time with Uncle Marcus shifted to confusion and then embarrassment. They were learning, in real time, that their uncle was someone to be ashamed of, someone whose circumstances made him a target for ridicule rather than an object of respect. I had survived IED explosions, sniper fire, sandstorms that lasted for days, and political machinations that would have made Machiavelli proud. But standing in that checkout line, holding an EBT card while my sister-in-law performed her cruelty for an audience of strangers, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. That's when Margaret Santos, the store manager, appeared like a guardian angel in a blue vest, and everything changed. Margaret Santos didn't just know my rank. She knew my name, my service record, probably my deployment history. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, the precision of her words, all screamed military training. As she escorted me to Register 3, I caught sight of a small Marine Corps emblem, pinned discreetly to her name tag. 20 years of reading people in combat zones told me she had served, and served well. "Semper Fi, Colonel," she said quietly as the teenage cashier began scanning my items with newfound efficiency. "3rd Marines, Camp Pendleton, retired Staff Sergeant Santos. I remember reading about your unit's work in Helmand Province." Jessica stood frozen behind us, her mouth slightly open, her children clinging to her cart like it might shield them from the sudden shift in atmosphere. David had gone pale, his usual smug confidence evaporating like morning dew in the desert heat. For the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel: respected. But that moment of dignity came with a price I wouldn't understand until later. Because what Margaret Santos didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that my family had already decided I was a lost cause, long before I ever needed government assistance. The food stamps were just the latest chapter in a story that had been written the day I came home from my final deployment, with a spine full of shrapnel and a head full of memories that wouldn't stay buried. The injury happened on a Tuesday morning in October, during what should have been a routine patrol outside Forward Operating Base Chapman. I was riding in the second vehicle of a 4-truck convoy when the IED detonated underneath us. The blast flipped our armored vehicle twice before it came to rest upside down in a ditch that smelled like burning diesel and human fear. My driver, Sergeant Patricia Williams, died instantly. My gunner, Corporal James Chen, lost his left leg below the knee. I walked away with what the medics called moderate spinal trauma, and what I called the end of everything I had built my identity around for more than 2 decades. The Army processed my medical discharge with the same efficiency they used for everything else. Maximum bureaucracy. Minimum compassion. I went from commanding 200 soldiers to sitting in waiting rooms filled with other broken warriors. All of us learning that the phrase, "thank you for your service," was often just another way of saying your usefulness has expired. But the real betrayal hadn't come from the institution I served. It came from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. David's first response to my injury wasn't concern or sympathy. It was a suggestion that I should diversify my skill set and think about civilian applications for military leadership. He offered to get me a job selling insurance for one of his golf buddies, a position that would have paid roughly what I used to spend on coffee during a single deployment. When I explained that I couldn't sit in an office chair for more than 30 minutes without excruciating pain, he suggested I was being dramatic. When I mentioned that my disability rating made me eligible for certain benefits, he actually laughed out loud and asked if I was going to become one of those veterans who milked the system. Jessica had been even worse. During my first month back, when I was staying in their guest room while navigating the medical discharge process, she complained constantly about my mood swings and my inability to sleep through the night. She told David within my hearing that having me in the house was affecting the children's sense of security. The breaking point came when I woke up screaming one night, lost in a flashback to the convoy attack. Emma, my 8-year-old niece, had been sleeping in the room next door and heard the whole thing. Instead of asking if I was okay, Jessica stormed into my room and demanded to know if I was having some kind of breakdown and whether she needed to call someone. The someone she was thinking of calling wasn't a doctor or a therapist. It was the police. That's when I realized my own family saw me not as a wounded warrior deserving of care, but as a potential threat to be managed. I moved out the next morning, despite David's half-hearted protests and Jessica's obvious relief. The apartment hunting process taught me things about civilian life that no military training had prepared me for. Landlords who were happy to give lip service to supporting veterans were suddenly less enthusiastic when they learned about my disability rating and limited income. Credit checks revealed that military service, despite its steady pay, didn't build the kind of credit history that impressed property managers. I finally found the studio apartment through a program run by a local veterans organization. The rent was subsidized, the neighborhood was questionable, but it was mine. For the first time since coming home, I had a space where I didn't have to explain my nightmares or apologize for my limitations. But independence came with its own set of challenges. The VA disability payments, while better than nothing, weren't designed for someone trying to rebuild a life from scratch. After rent, utilities, and medical copays, I had roughly $300 a month for everything else. Food, transportation, clothing, and the 1,000 small expenses that civilian life seemed to demand. I applied for food assistance not out of laziness or entitlement, but out of mathematics. $300 divided by 30 days meant $10 per day for all non-housing expenses. After bus fare to medical appointments and the occasional load of laundry at the coin-operated machines in my building's basement, that left maybe $6 a day for food. I had tried to make it work without government help, spent 2 months eating nothing but peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup, lost 20 pounds I couldn't afford to lose, and developed a persistent cough that the VA doctors said was probably related to malnutrition-induced immune deficiency. The day I finally walked into the SNAP office was one of the hardest of my life. Harder than boot camp, harder than my first firefight, harder even than watching Sergeant Williams get loaded into a body bag. Because it meant admitting that 23 years of military service, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart weren't enough to keep me from needing help buying groceries. The caseworker, a tired-looking woman named Maria, who probably processed 50 similar cases every week, was kind but efficient. She explained the program, had me fill out forms, and issued me an EBT card with the same casual professionalism she might have used to renew someone's driver's license. "No shame in this, Colonel," she said as she handed me the card. "You earned this benefit just like you earned your military pay. It's part of the social contract." But shame, I learned, wasn't something you could rationalize away. It lived in your chest like shrapnel, sharp and persistent. reminding you every day that you had fallen short of some invisible standard of self-sufficiency that society demanded of its heroes. David found out about the food stamps 3 weeks after I started using them. I hadn't told him, hadn't told anyone, but somehow word had gotten back to him. Maybe through the Veterans Organization where he occasionally volunteered for tax write-off purposes. Maybe through one of his real estate contacts who worked with government programs. His response was a phone call that lasted exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I know because I timed it, the way I used to time enemy radio transmissions during intelligence gathering operations. Jesus, Marcus, he said without preamble. Food stamps? Really? Do you know how this reflects on the family? I've got clients, I've got a reputation in this community. What am I supposed to tell people when they ask about my brother? I had suggested that he could tell people his brother served his country with honor and was now navigating the challenges of reintegration like thousands of other veterans. I suggested that he could express pride in my service rather than shame in my circumstances. His response was silence, followed by a sigh that conveyed more disappointment than I had heard from him since we were children fighting over who got to use the television after school. Look, he said finally, I know you've been through a lot, but at some point you have to take responsibility for your situation. You can't blame everything on the army or your injury or whatever. Other people have problems too, and they don't end up on government assistance. That conversation ended with me hanging up on my brother for the first time in our adult lives. But it wouldn't be the last time he found ways to remind me that my struggles were inconvenient for his image. The grocery store incident with Jessica wasn't spontaneous cruelty. It was calculated humiliation, designed to put me in my place and establish clear social hierarchy in front of her children. She wanted Emma and Jake to understand that their successful father and well-dressed mother were the family members worth emulating, while their uncle represented a cautionary tale about what happened when you made poor choices. What she didn't count on was Margaret Santos, a retired Marine who understood that service meant something beyond what politicians said in speeches on Veterans Day. Margaret had seen the look in my eyes, the way I carried myself despite my circumstances, the small details that civilians missed but military personnel recognized instantly. But as Margaret finished processing my discounted groceries and handed me my receipt with a crisp, "Thank you for your service," that actually meant something, I realized this moment of dignity was about to become another weapon in my family's ongoing campaign to reshape my identity from decorated veteran to family embarrassment. David was already pulling out his phone, probably to call Jessica and discuss damage control. Because in their world, having a brother who used food stamps was manageable as long as nobody important found out. But having a brother who used food stamps and got special treatment because of his military service, that was the kind of story that might get back to the country club. The phone call came 3 days later while I was sitting on my apartment floor, doing physical therapy exercises that hurt like hell but kept my spine from seizing up completely. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice belonged to Margaret Santos from the Walmart. "Colonel Martinez," she said, her tone professional but warm. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I got your number from the Veterans Affairs office. There's something I need to discuss with you, and I think it would be better done in person." We met at a small cafe near the VA hospital, the kind of place that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and didn't mind if you sat for hours nursing a single cup. Margaret arrived wearing civilian clothes, but she still moved like a Marine, purposeful and direct. "I've been thinking about what happened at the store," she began, stirring sugar into her black coffee. "Your family's behavior bothered me more than I let on. But it's not just about basic decency. There's something else." She pulled out a tablet and showed me a video that made my blood run cold. Security footage from the store, showing the entire checkout incident in perfect detail. Jessica's performance was even more cruel than I remembered, her voice dripping with contempt as she made jokes about my circumstances for the entertainment of strangers. "This footage has been making rounds in the local veterans community," Margaret said quietly. "Someone shared it on social media, and it's gone viral in military circles. People are outraged." I watched myself on the screen, hunched and defeated, while my brother stood silent and my sister-in-law performed her cruelty like it was dinner theater. The comments below the video were a mixture of support for me and fury directed at my family. "There's more," Margaret continued. "After the video started circulating, I got calls from other people who know your family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Turns out this wasn't an isolated incident. She showed me screenshots of social media posts, private messages, emails that painted a picture I had never seen from the outside. David and Jessica had been telling people about my situation for months, but not with concern or sympathy. They had been using my struggles as entertainment, turning my disabilities into punchlines at dinner parties and social gatherings. One message thread showed Jessica texting with friends from her book club, describing my living situation with mock concern that barely concealed her amusement. "Poor Marcus is so dramatic about his little injury," she had written. "You'd think he lost a limb instead of just hurting his back. David says he's milking it for attention." Another screenshot showed David's response to a client who had asked about veteran housing programs. "My brother's in one of those subsidized places," he had written. "Honestly, I think some of these guys just don't want to work. The military makes them soft." The betrayal was systematic, calculated, ongoing. They hadn't just abandoned me in my time of need. They had weaponized my suffering for their own social currency, turning my service and sacrifice into proof of their superiority. "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice dropping. "The VA has been investigating complaints about your disability rating. Someone filed a report claiming you were exaggerating your symptoms to get benefits you didn't deserve." My hands went numb. A fraudulent disability claim was a federal crime that could result in prison time and the loss of all benefits. "Who filed the report?" Margaret's expression told me everything I needed to know before she said the words. "The complaint came from a family member who claimed to have first-hand knowledge of your condition, David Martinez, listed as your brother and emergency contact." The world tilted sideways. My own brother had tried to have me investigated for fraud, had attempted to take away the only thing standing between me and homelessness. The man who had stood beside me at our father's funeral, who had been best man at my wedding before it fell apart under the strain of deployment separations, who had promised to look after me if anything ever happened overseas. "The investigation was dropped," Margaret continued quickly. "Your medical records are ironclad, and the VA doctors who examined you backed up every aspect of your disability rating." David answered the door in golf clothes, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Marcus, what are you doing here? You can't just show up without calling." I walked past him into the house, my spine screaming in protest, but my resolve steady. "We need to talk about your complaint to the VA." His face went white. For a moment, he looked like the scared little boy I remembered from childhood, caught in a lie and calculating whether denial or confession would serve him better. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshots Margaret had shared, his texts about my situation, Jessica's cruel commentary, the pattern of humiliation they had built around my circumstances. Then I showed him the official documentation of his fraud complaint, complete with his signature and detailed accusations. "You tried to have me arrested," I said, my voice calm and cold. "You tried to take away my disability benefits and have me prosecuted for fraud. Your own brother." David sat down heavily on his expensive couch, surrounded by the material success that had become more important to him than basic human decency. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he said weakly. "Jessica's friends, my clients, everyone knows about your situation. It reflects on me professionally. So you decided to destroy me to protect your reputation." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Genuine fear. Not of physical confrontation, but of consequences. The video had shown the world exactly who he was, and the veterans community had a long memory for those who betrayed their own. "The job offer came through," I told him. "I'm moving to DC next month. I'll be working with other veterans, helping them navigate the same system you tried to use against me." I stood up, my back protesting but my spirit stronger than it had been in months. "I won't be coming back to Arizona. I won't be calling on holidays or birthdays. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a brother anymore." David started to say something, probably another attempt at justification or manipulation, but I was already walking toward the door. "Marcus, wait," he called after me. "We're family." I stopped and turned back one last time. "No," I said. "Family doesn't abandon each other. Family doesn't try to destroy each other for social points. You're just someone I used to know. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office in Arlington, Virginia, helping a recently discharged Navy veteran navigate the disability claims process. My back still hurt every day. I still woke up sometimes in the grip of nightmares about convoy attacks. But I had found something I thought I had lost forever: purpose. The Veterans Transition Program had grown beyond Patricia's original vision. We were helping hundreds of service members every month, providing not just bureaucratic assistance, but the kind of support system that understood the unique challenges of military to civilian transition. Margaret Santos had moved to D.C. as well, taking a position with our organization as Director of Outreach. She still carried herself like a Marine, still believed that service meant something, and she had built a network of support that reached veterans across the country. The video of the grocery store incident had become a teaching tool, a stark example of how society sometimes treats the people who serve it. But more importantly, it had connected me with a community of people who understood that dignity wasn't something you lost when you needed help. It was something you carried with you regardless of circumstances. I never heard from David or Jessica again. The last I knew, they had moved to a different neighborhood after the video made them locally famous for all the wrong reasons. Emma and Jake would grow up learning a different definition of family loyalty than the one their parents had modeled. Sometimes people ask me if I miss them, if I regret cutting ties with my blood relatives. The answer is complicated. I miss the idea of family, the hope that the people who knew you longest would love you most completely. But I don't miss the constant weight of their judgment, the exhausting performance of gratitude for scraps of basic decency. I learned that families aren't just born, they're built. Mine now includes Margaret and Patricia, the veterans I work with every day, the community of service members, who understand that brotherhood isn't about shared genetics, but shared values. My EBT card sits in my wallet next to my new security clearance, a reminder of how quickly circumstances can change and how much character is revealed in how we treat people when they're struggling. I don't need it anymore, but I keep it as a promise to myself that I'll never forget what it feels like to be hungry, homeless, or hopeless. Because that's what real service looks like. Not the uniform you wear or the rank you hold, but the hand you extend to help someone else climb out of the hole you once found yourself in. 2 years into my work at the Veterans Transition Center, I thought I had seen every possible variation of how service members get betrayed by the system, by society, by their own families. Then Rebecca Hoffman walked into my office on a rainy Thursday morning in March, and I realized I was still learning. She was Navy, former hospital corpsman, discharged after a training accident left her with chronic pain and PTSD that manifested in ways the military medical system wasn't equipped to handle. But what brought her to my office wasn't her disability rating or her housing situation. It was a custody battle that was tearing her apart from the inside. "My ex-husband is using my veteran status against me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's telling the court that my military service makes me unfit to be around our daughter. Says I'm unstable, violent, that I can't handle stress without breaking down." I had heard variations of this story before, but Rebecca's case had a particular cruelty that made my chest tighten with familiar rage. Her ex-husband, a civilian who had never served a day in his life, was painting her military service not as heroic sacrifice but as evidence of mental deficiency. He was using her PTSD diagnosis, her disability rating, even her veteran benefits as proof that she was an unfit mother. "The worst part," Rebecca continued, tears starting to flow, "is that my own parents are supporting him. They're testifying on his behalf, saying they're worried about their granddaughter's safety if she stays with me." I set down my pen and really looked at her. Rebecca was maybe 35, with the kind of posture that never fully relaxes even in civilian clothes. Her hands shook slightly, whether from medication side effects or stress, I couldn't tell. But her eyes held something I recognized from my own mirror on the worst days. The look of someone who had given everything in service to others, only to discover that sacrifice had been reframed as weakness. "Tell me about your parents," I said. Rebecca's story unfolded like a roadmap of disappointment I knew by heart. Parents who had been proud when she enlisted, who bragged to neighbors about their daughter serving her country, who displayed her graduation photos from boot camp and medical training. But when she came home damaged, when her service-connected injuries made her inconvenient rather than heroic, their pride curdled into embarrassment. "They don't understand why I can't just get over it," she said, making air quotes around the phrase. "Mom keeps asking why I can't be more like my sister, who went to college and got married and never caused any drama. Dad actually told the court-appointed psychologist that he thinks the military broke me and that I'm not the same person who left for boot camp. I thought about my own father, dead for 5 years now, who had never lived to see me rebuild my life or understand that strength sometimes looks like asking for help. I thought about David, who had chosen reputation over relationship, who had tried to destroy me, rather than admit that my circumstances reflected poorly on his image of himself as a successful provider and protector. Rebecca," I said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe you're a good mother?" She looked startled by the directness of the question. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I love my daughter more than anything in the world. I would die for her. I have died for other people's children in places they can't pronounce, in wars they don't understand. Of course I'm a good mother." "Then we're going to prove it." Over the next 3 months, I worked with Rebecca to document everything her ex-husband and parents had overlooked or deliberately ignored. Her volunteer work with local youth programs. Her spotless record as a single mother before the custody dispute began. The way her daughter lit up when talking about her mom during supervised visits. The fact that her PTSD symptoms were managed and monitored by qualified professionals. But more importantly, we gathered testimony from her chosen family, the community of veterans who had watched her rebuild her life with grace and determination. Margaret Santos provided a character reference that detailed Rebecca's work ethic and reliability. Colonel Webb wrote a letter explaining how PTSD was a normal response to abnormal situations, not a character flaw or a sign of instability. The breakthrough came when we discovered that Rebecca's ex-husband had been coaching their daughter, teaching her to say things that would make her mother look bad during custody evaluations. The court-appointed guardian caught him on tape telling 8-year-old Sophie to tell the judge that mommy gets scary when she has bad dreams. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late June. Rebecca wore her dress blues, not as a costume or a prop, but as a reminder to everyone in that courtroom that she had earned the right to be seen as something more than a collection of diagnoses and disabilities. I sat in the gallery behind her, along with 6 other veterans who had come to show support. Margaret was there, still carrying herself like the Marine she would always be. 2 of Rebecca's Navy buddies had driven down from Baltimore. A Vietnam veteran named George, who attended our support group meetings, sat in the front row, wearing his Purple Heart on his civilian suit. Rebecca's ex-husband looked confident when he walked in with his lawyer and Rebecca's parents. He nodded to the judge like they were old friends, straightened his expensive tie, and prepared to deliver what he clearly thought would be the final blow to Rebecca's parental rights. But confidence built on lies has a way of crumbling under scrutiny. When the guardian presented the recording of him coaching their daughter, his face went pale. When Rebecca's military supervisors testified about her exemplary service record, his lawyer stopped taking notes. When Sophie herself, in a private session with the family court judge, broke down and admitted that Daddy had told her what to say about Mommy, the facade collapsed entirely. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Full custody to Rebecca, with supervised visitation for the father, pending completion of parenting classes, and psychological evaluation. She also issued a restraining order preventing him from discussing Rebecca's military service or mental health with their daughter. But the most powerful moment came during the judge's closing remarks, when she looked directly at Rebecca's parents and said, "I find it deeply troubling that the people who should be most proud of this young woman's service to her country have instead chosen to weaponize that service against her. Shame on you." Rebecca collapsed into my arms in the courthouse hallway afterward, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Sophie ran to her mother, and for the first time in months, Rebecca held her daughter without a social worker watching, without time limits, without the crushing weight of uncertainty about their future together. That evening, our entire veterans community gathered at a local restaurant to celebrate. It wasn't just about Rebecca's victory, it was about all of us, about every veteran who had been told that their service made them dangerous or unstable or unfit for civilian life. Margaret raised a toast with her beer bottle. To the families we build when the ones we're born into fail us. But the real celebration came 3 days later, when Rebecca called to tell me about a conversation she had with Sophie. "Mommy," her daughter had said while they were making breakfast together, "I'm sorry I said those things about you. Daddy told me I had to, but I knew they weren't true. You're not scary. You're brave." Rebecca had knelt down to her daughter's eye level and said, "Sophie, I need you to understand something. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes when they're hurting or scared. Your daddy loves you, and Grandma and Grandpa love you too. But they were wrong about me, and they were wrong to ask you to help them be wrong. Are you going to forgive them?" Sophie had asked. Rebecca told me she had thought about that question for a long time before answering. "Forgiveness isn't about them, baby. It's about us not carrying around heavy feelings that make it hard to be happy. I forgive them because I don't want to spend my energy being angry anymore. I want to spend it taking care of you and building the life we deserve." 6 months later, Rebecca joined our staff as a family advocacy specialist. Her first case was a former Air Force mechanic whose in-laws were trying to have her children removed from her custody because they disagreed with her decision to transition after her discharge. Her second case involved a Marine veteran whose parents had convinced his ex-wife that his combat experience made him a danger to their son. The patterns were depressingly consistent, but so was our response. We had learned that the antidote to family betrayal wasn't revenge or even reconciliation. It was building something better, something stronger, something based on chosen loyalty rather than accidental genetics. I still think about David sometimes, wonder if he ever connects the dots between his own actions and the empty chair at holiday dinners. I wonder if Jessica ever explains to Emma and Jake why their uncle isn't part of their lives anymore, or if she's convinced them that I was the problem, the ungrateful relative who couldn't appreciate their generosity. But mostly I think about the families we create in the ruins of the ones that failed us. Margaret, now like a sister to me in ways my actual siblings never were. Patricia, whose mentorship gave me purpose when I thought I had lost everything. Rebecca, whose strength reminds me daily that survival isn't just about enduring but about choosing to trust again despite every reason not to. The Veterans Transition Center now serves over 3,000 veterans annually. We've expanded beyond D.C. to offices in 12 cities, with more opening every month. But the most important work we do can't be measured in statistics or grant applications. It's in the moment when someone realizes they're not alone, when they understand that their service meant something even if their families don't see it that way. Every Thursday morning, I lead a support group for veterans dealing with family estrangement. We sit in a circle, drink terrible coffee from paper cups, and tell the truth about what it feels like to be discarded by the people who were supposed to love us unconditionally. We don't offer false hope about reconciliation or platitudes about blood being thicker than water. Instead, we offer something more valuable. Proof that you can build a life worth living even after your foundation crumbles. That dignity isn't something others can take from you. It's something you carry within yourself. That family isn't who raised you or who shares your DNA. It's who shows up when you need them most. Sometimes, late at night when my back is acting up and sleep feels impossible, I think about that day in the Walmart checkout line. How small I felt, how defeated, how convinced I was that my best days were behind me. I think about Jessica's laughter and David's silence, and the way strangers looked at me like I was exactly what my family said I was. A failure, a burden, someone to be pitied rather than respected. Then I think about Margaret Santos, appearing like a guardian angel in a blue vest, reminding me and everyone within earshot that I was still Colonel Martinez, that my service still mattered, that some people understood the difference between temporary circumstances and permanent worth. That moment changed everything, not because it solved my problems, but because it reminded me who I was beneath the pain and the poverty and the family rejection. It gave me back my name, my rank, my sense of self when I needed it most. Now I try to be Margaret Santos for other veterans, to show up in their checkout line moments and remind them that their service matters, that their struggles don't define them, that there are people who understand the weight they carry and are willing to help them carry it. 5 years after that humiliating day in the Walmart checkout line, I found myself standing in the produce section of a Whole Foods in Arlington, Virginia, selecting organic apples for a dinner party I was hosting at my townhouse. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was shopping without checking prices, buying ingredients for a meal I was cooking for friends who had become family, planning an evening that would end with laughter instead of shame. My cart contained items I once would have considered luxuries: fresh salmon, artisanal bread, wine that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. But the real luxury was the absence of anxiety, the knowledge that my debit card wouldn't be declined, that I wasn't calculating whether I could afford both protein and vegetables. The Veterans Transition Center had grown beyond anything Patricia Webb and I had imagined when she first offered me that position in D.C. We now operated in 18 cities across 12 states, with a staff of over 200 people, most of them veterans themselves. Our programs had expanded to include not just transition services but legal advocacy, family mediation, small business development, and emergency financial assistance. I had been promoted to National Director of Operations 3 years earlier, a position that came with a salary I still sometimes couldn't believe was real, a corner office with windows that looked out over the Potomac, and the kind of respect I had thought I lost forever when I started using food stamps. But success measured in dollars and square footage wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the phone call I had received that morning from Thomas Chen, a former Army medic whose parents had disowned him after his PTSD diagnosis. He was calling to tell me he had just graduated from nursing school, that he had landed a job at Walter Reed, that he was getting married to a woman who understood his nightmares and loved him anyway. "I wanted you to know," Thomas had said, his voice thick with emotion, "that when I was sleeping in my car 3 years ago, convinced I was worthless, you saved my life. Not just by helping me get housing and benefits, but by showing me that being broken doesn't mean being worthless." Those were the calls that made everything worthwhile. Not the congressional testimony I gave about veteran services, not the award ceremony where I received recognition for public service, not even the feature article in Military Times that called me a, quote, visionary leader in veteran advocacy. It was the individual stories, the lives rebuilt, the futures reclaimed. Margaret Santos had become my closest friend and most trusted colleague. She ran our West Coast operations from an office in San Diego, but we talked almost daily, sharing war stories from the bureaucratic trenches and celebrating victories large and small. She had never married, claimed the Corps was the only institution she ever loved enough to commit to, but she had become the loving aunt to dozens of veterans' children, the godmother who showed up to graduations and birthday parties and soccer games. "You know what I realized the other day?" she had said during our last video call. "We've created something our biological families never gave us: unconditional support. Not unconditional love, because love without accountability isn't love at all. But unconditional support, the promise that we'll show up for each other no matter what." I thought about that conversation as I moved through the grocery store, nodding to other shoppers who might have been neighbors or colleagues or complete strangers. The anonymity was peaceful. Nobody here knew about my EBT card days or my family's betrayal, or the nights I had spent wondering if the pain in my back was worth the effort of continuing to breathe. At the checkout line, a different kind of scene was unfolding. An elderly man in a faded navy cap was fumbling with a handful of crumpled bills, trying to pay for a small bag of groceries that clearly represented careful budgeting. The cashier, a young woman with pink streaks in her hair and more patience than her minimum wage job probably deserved, was helping him count out exact change. Behind him, a well-dressed couple in their 40s was making no effort to hide their impatience. The woman sighed dramatically and checked her phone. The man muttered something about holding up the line, loud enough for everyone to hear. I watched the old sailor's hands shake as he searched his pockets for 2 more quarters, saw the shame creep across his weathered face as he realized he might have to put something back. Without thinking, I stepped forward. "Sir," I said, addressing the veteran, "let me cover the difference." He looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much, lived too long, survived too many disappointments. "Son, I don't need charity." "It's not charity," I said, handing the cashier a $20 bill. It's one service member looking out for another. Buy yourself something you want, not just what you need. The old man studied my face for a moment, taking in details that civilian eyes might miss. The way I stood, the military bearing that never fully leaves, the understanding in my expression that came from shared experience. Army? He asked. Yes, sir. 23 years. Colonel, retired. He straightened, his posture shifting into something that remembered younger days and sharper salutes. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, retired. 31 years, 3 wars, 2 divorces, and one hell of a grateful handshake for you, Colonel. We shook hands, and I felt the calluses that spoke of decades of honest work. The firm grip that said dignity wasn't something you lost when your bank account ran low. Behind us, the impatient couple had grown quiet, perhaps recognizing that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple act of generosity. As Master Chief Rodriguez walked away with his groceries and my extra $20, I thought about all the time someone could have shown me that same kindness during my darkest period. How different my experience might have been if David or Jessica had seen my circumstances as temporary rather than defining, if they had offered support instead of judgment. But I also understood now that their failure to love me properly wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a limitation of their character, a blindness that prevented them from recognizing strength when it wore the costume of struggle. The impatient couple approached the register next, their organic produce and premium products making a statement about lifestyle and priorities. The woman looked at me with what might have been curiosity or judgment, then said, "That was very nice of you." "He earned it," I replied simply. "Are you military?" The man asked, his tone carrying a different quality now, less dismissiveness and more genuine interest. I was. Now I work with veteran services, helping people transition back to civilian life. That must be rewarding work, the woman said, and I could hear her recalibrating her assessment of me, adjusting her assumptions based on new information. It is. Every day I get to help someone realize that their service matters, that their struggles don't define them, that there are people who understand what they've been through. I paid for my groceries and walked to my car, a reliable Honda that I had bought with cash from my first year's salary at the Veterans Center. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine, completely paid for, a symbol of the stability I had rebuilt from nothing. On the drive home, I took a detour past the apartment complex where I had lived during those desperate months after my discharge. The building looked the same, tired and worn, but not hopeless. I knew there were probably veterans living there now, fighting the same battles I had fought, wondering if their lives would ever get better. I made a mental note to have our outreach team visit the complex, to leave information about our services in the community center, to make sure that anyone struggling knew they weren't alone. That was how change happened, not through grand gestures, but through consistent presence, through showing up in the places where people hurt. My townhouse sat on a quiet street, lined with maple trees that turned brilliant orange every October. I had bought it 2 years earlier, the first piece of real estate I had ever owned. A 3-bedroom place with a small yard where I grew tomatoes and herbs and raised beds that accommodated my back problems. The house would be full tonight with friends coming for dinner. Margaret was flying in from California. Patricia Webb was bringing her husband and teenage daughter. Rebecca Hoffman would be there with Sophie, now 13, and thriving in her new school. Thomas Chen was coming with his fiancée. A dozen other veterans and their families, people who had become my chosen family through shared understanding and mutual support. I unpacked my groceries in a kitchen that smelled like the rosemary growing on my windowsill, arranged flowers I had bought simply because they were beautiful, opened wine to let it breathe. These were the luxuries that mattered. Time to prepare a meal with care, space to welcome people I loved, the security of knowing that tomorrow would bring purpose rather than panic. As I seasoned the salmon and prepped vegetables, I thought about the phone call I hadn't received in over 4 years. David had never reached out after our final confrontation, never acknowledged the success I had built from the ashes of his betrayal. Jessica's social media presence, which I occasionally glimpsed through mutual acquaintances, showed a carefully curated life of family vacations and accomplishments. No mention of the brother-in-law who had disappeared from their narrative. Emma and Jake would be teenagers now, old enough to ask questions about why they never saw their uncle anymore, old enough to search the internet and find articles about the Veterans Transition Center, maybe even the video of that day in Walmart that had started everything. I wondered sometimes what they had been told about my absence, whether they understood that love was supposed to be bigger than circumstance. But those thoughts no longer carried the weight they once did. I had learned that healing wasn't about getting apologies from people who hurt you. It was about building a life so full of genuine love and purpose that their absence stopped being a wound and became simply an empty space that others had filled. The doorbell rang at 6:30, and my house began filling with the sound of conversations that mattered, laughter that came from joy rather than cruelty, the comfortable chaos of people who had chosen to be family. Margaret arrived with stories from California, and a bottle of bourbon she claimed was good enough to make a Marine weep. Patricia brought homemade bread and updates on 3 new grant applications that would expand our services. Rebecca's daughter Sophie had grown into a confident young woman who spoke passionately about her plan to become a veterinarian and work with service dogs. Thomas and his fiancée Maria shared wedding plans and their hopes for children who would grow up understanding that service was about lifting others up, not pushing them down. As we sat around my dining room table, sharing food and stories and dreams for the future, I realized that this was what victory looked like. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of people who would stand with you in the struggle. Not the erasure of past pain, but the transformation of that pain into purpose. Margaret raised her glass of bourbon and looked around the table. To Marcus, she said, who taught us that family isn't about who raised you, but who refuses to give up on you. The chorus of agreement warmed me more than any recognition I had ever received. These people knew my story, understood my journey, celebrated my growth, not because it made them look good, but because they genuinely cared about my well-being. After dinner, as we sat in my living room with coffee and dessert, Patricia's daughter asked me a question that stopped all conversation. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "my mom told me about what happened with your family, how they treated you when you were struggling. Do you ever miss them?" The room went quiet, everyone understanding that this was a question that deserved a thoughtful answer. I looked at this young woman, so earnest and curious, trying to understand how families could break and how people could heal. "I miss the idea of them," I said finally. "I miss having parents who were proud of my service, siblings who supported me through difficult times. But I don't miss the people they actually were, the ones who saw my struggles as inconvenience rather than opportunity to show love." "But doesn't it hurt?" she pressed. "Not having them in your life?" I thought about that question for a long moment, aware that my answer might shape how this young woman understood loyalty and forgiveness, and the complex mathematics of human relationships. "It hurt terribly for a long time," I said. "But you know what I learned? Some relationships are toxic, not because of what people do to you, but because of what you have to become to maintain them. I had to make myself smaller, quieter, more grateful for scraps than I deserved. I had to accept being treated as less than I was worth." I gestured around the room at the faces of people who had become my family. But look what happened when I stopped accepting that treatment. I found people who see my whole self, who celebrate my victories and support me through struggles. I found a family that was chosen rather than assigned, built rather than assumed. "So you don't regret cutting them off?" she asked. "I regret that it was necessary," I said. "But I don't regret choosing peace over pain, respect over familiarity, authentic love over conditional acceptance." The evening wound down with promises to stay in touch, plans for future gatherings, the comfortable rituals of people who knew they would see each other again soon. After everyone left, I stood in my kitchen loading the dishwasher, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived. Empty wine glasses that had held toasts to friendship, plates that had carried food prepared with love, coffee cups stained with conversations that mattered. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, already on her way back to California. "Thank you for tonight, for everything, for showing us what it means to build something beautiful from broken pieces." I typed back, "Thank you for showing up, for staying, for proving that family is something we create, not something we inherit." That night, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea, looking up at stars that seemed brighter in the suburbs than they ever had during my deployment years. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of the tomatoes growing in my garden, the sound of my neighbor's comfortable domestic life filtering through open windows. I thought about Master Chief Rodriguez from the grocery store, wondered if he was sitting somewhere having dinner he could afford because of a small kindness. I thought about all the veterans who would walk into our offices tomorrow, carrying burdens they shouldn't have to carry alone, ready to discover that their service mattered and their struggles were temporary. Most of all, I thought about the journey from that humiliating day in Walmart to this peaceful evening in my own home, surrounded by evidence of a life rebuilt on purpose and populated with people who chose to love me. The distance between those two moments wasn't measured in miles or years, but in the revolutionary act of deciding that I deserved better than what my biological family had been willing to offer. I had learned that dignity wasn't something others could give you or take away. It was something you carried within yourself, something that survived poverty and pain and public humiliation. It was the knowledge that your worth wasn't determined by your circumstances but by your character, not by who claimed you but by who you chose to claim in return. The Veterans Transition Center would continue to grow, to serve, to prove that warriors deserved better than being discarded when their usefulness to the institution ended. But the real victory was smaller and more personal. The knowledge that I had survived the worst thing that could happen to a person, the betrayal of family, and had built something better in its place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new veterans to serve, new stories of abandonment and redemption to witness. But tonight I was simply a man who had found his way home, not to the place where he was born, but to the life he had earned through the radical act of refusing to accept less love than he deserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.